So if you've made a climate emergency declaration at your local government level, you will need an action plan to deliver on that. And we're going to look at action planning in the context of all of the levers of influence that we have available to us as local government and the changes that we need to make as a society to reach a zero carbon world. Before we look into those in any detail, we'll briefly recap some of the data and the urgency of the issue that's facing us. So we saw earlier that although we know that the Industrial Revolution sort of kick-started the process of putting man-made carbon emissions into the atmosphere, the pace of change really kicked up many, many notches after the Second World War, with an increased rate of emissions from about 1990 onwards. So the vast majority of the climate change-inducing emissions that have been emitted to the atmosphere have occurred within the last 30 years or so. And really pre-1950, the impact was very minimal. So this is a problem created by our generations, and it's a problem that has rapidly changed over the last couple of decades, and it's something that we now have to tackle with extreme urgency. The trajectory that we're currently on is that the globe will be warming by about 1.5 degrees centigrade, whether or not we stopped emitting everything tomorrow. And that's because a certain amount of warming is already baked in. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report of late 2018, otherwise referred to as the IPCC, is a specific report looking at whether it's possible to keep it at that level of change only, or whether we will overshoot that in terms of global temperature rises. And that report laid out very clearly that if we don't get emissions down within the decade that we've now entered, within the 2020s, if we don't get emissions down by almost 50%, we will find it almost impossible to stay on that rise of 1.5 degrees. And it's important to realize that we're not aiming for 1.5 degrees. There's nothing attractive about it. There are huge climatic and biodiversity impacts of that change. At this stage, it's really the least worst option. So we're trying to do everything we can to make rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented change within this decade, and then to get emissions down to zero by 2030. And this is where local government is so important. This is a pie chart taken from a presentation given by the chair of the Committee on Climate Change in 2018. And what it really shows is that of all the work we still need to do to get our emissions down to zero, well over half of it involves either wholly or partially behaviour change. And what the chair was saying when she gave this presentation is much of what we've achieved on paper looks very good. We've managed to get our emissions down very well over the last few decades, and it's all been done in a way that's invisible to people. It's been technological change, it's been efficiency of appliances and of vehicles being improved. So it's very much behind the scenes technocratic work. And we're now into the realms of having to do all of the things that require us individually and as communities to change. And this is where it's so important that parish and town councils and local authorities are leading the way and setting those new social norms. It's also important, bearing that in mind, that we really just dwell for a moment on this idea of the difference between complicated and complex work. One of the things that people become very fixated on when they first declared a climate emergency is that they immediately look to their own estate, which is not unusual and is needed. What can we do with our buildings? Where can we put some electric car chargers? That sort of thing. And this is what I call complicated work. It's technical work, technical in nature. It often requires a certain amount of engineering. It's physical. It can be project managed. It can often be budgeted for in a fairly clear way so that everybody knows the risks and the timetables involved. It's very measurable and it lends itself to standard project management techniques. It's also kind of attractive and exciting. It's often very PR worthy and photo ready. So when we've put solar panels on the parish hall or on the council offices, we can take a photo and we can have a press release. And we can take credit for that. So this is the kind of work that really attracts councils once they start thinking about having declared a climate emergency. And we need to set that against the complex work that needs to be done. This is the difficult work where we don't really control the entire system. This is about what happens in the community. This is about social norming. It's about communicating, it's about behaviour change. It often can't be planned on a spreadsheet. And most importantly, we often can't measure the benefit compared to the input that we'd have to put into it. So we can't sort of do a cost benefit analysis and say, if we spend this much time communicating, we'll get this much monetary payback. complex action is where most of the work now needs to be done. And if we as local government focus only on our own buildings and our own estate, we will never achieve the changes we need. So moving on to look now at the action planning, I think it's really important that people, when they've made a climate emergency declaration, don't suddenly feel that they have to invent from scratch everything that needs to happen to drive us to a zero carbon future. The zero carbon transition is very well understood. The work of people like the Committee on Climate Change and CAT's Zero Carbon Britain report lay out quite clearly for us what we need to do. And we've looked at this work for a long time, and with working with local authorities, we've summarised the changes that need to be made into these 13 change targets that we talk about. So I'm going to run through those now, and then we're going to talk about the levers of influence that we have to bring to bear on those change targets. And that together forms the basis for our action planning exercise. So the first change target that we need to achieve is that we must have hugely reduced energy demand from all buildings, including heritage assets. There is a tendency for people to think that our heritage assets are sort of exempt in some way from changing. We must eliminate energy wastage from our buildings. We must insulate, draft-proof, improve our glazing and shutters if we have them. And we must think about using efficient appliances and change how we behave within our homes. Effectively, the building stock we already have will still be with us in the next 100 years and probably in the next 200 years. And it cannot be that we only focus on what we do to buildings that are still to be built. So retrofit is important from a local government point of view, because local tradespeople will have to deliver it. Fundamentally, it has to be done by builders in people's houses. And so a really important role for local government is in bringing people in running trade shows and in supporting things like a Green Open Homes scheme where people can learn from each other about how they improve their homes. The second change target is that we have to be smarter and more flexible about how we manage energy demand. And that includes incorporating more storage of energy. We're quite unimaginative as a society, and we tend to all come home and turn everything on at the same time. We all cook our dinner at the same time. We all get up in the morning at the same time. And we need to be able to smooth those patterns of demand, because as we move from a centralized energy system to a decentralized energy system where we have lots more renewables, the more wasteful we are, and the more we are all trying to do the same thing at the same time, the more capacity we'll need. Our grid is really sized for the coldest day in January. That's the time when we're all at home with the lights on and the heating on, cooking our dinner. In June, it's only running at a fraction of its capacity. And we need to be able to smooth that demand both throughout the day, throughout the week, and also throughout the year. So thinking about, again, behaviour change, but also local projects around generation and storage is an important thing that local government can be doing. The third change target is that we have to decarbonise our power generation. And what this really means is we have to stop burning fossil fuels and incinerating waste to make electricity. So we have to be looking to move towards renewables and other sources of low carbon electricity. And that is hugely important at the local area. Fundamentally, these projects have to happen somewhere. And this is where parish councils, town councils and local authorities can really help frame the debate on how we build renewable energy in our area that works for our communities, to understand how the benefits will be distributed locally and how the decision-making processes will happen. If this feels like it's being imposed from above, then it tends to go horribly wrong and meets a lot of resistance at the local level. And on that same note, the fourth change target is not only do we have to have decarbonised our power system, we also need to decarbonise our heat delivery system. And you may be aware that government has already mandated that from 2025, new homes will not be allowed to have gas boilers fitted. But of course, as previously mentioned, most of our homes are already built and most of them are on the gas network. So we need to be, it ties in with the whole retrofit conversation, it ties in with the whole local trade supply, and it ties in with raising awareness and helping people learn from each other. It also, at the local government level, ties in with financing mechanisms. What can we do as parish and town councils, working with our local authorities and our county councils to help people find the financial mechanisms to change out their heating systems? Sort of mini local green deals could be a thing that work very well here. The fifth change target is that we have to reduce the amount of travel we do in the private cars that we own and increase active and public transport. And we all know this is a real touch paper issue in rural areas, the lack of public transport. Again, a network of parish councils coming together to look at transport and understanding what their needs are is really useful. Lots of local councils tend to think that the county is the strategic planning authority for transport, and therefore it's not their job. And it's really important that parishes grasp that a great deal of what needs to be done is at those very short journeys, under 2 miles from the edge of a village into the centre, or the edge of a town to the centre, short journeys and part journeys that could be moved off of a private car and into public or active travel. Those are the things that only grassroots on the ground knowledge will be able to support scheme design for. So really comprehensively producing that understanding and working with your county is a really good place to start. We also need to shift with the remaining vehicles we have from fossil fuels to electrified travel. So again, social norming, raising awareness, identifying with your local authority where EV charging points on streets should go so that they can apply for government grants for those. These are all incredibly useful bottom tier local government activities in relation to the EV transformation. We also, in terms of travel, have to massively reduce air travel. And it's really important that we come to recognise now at this point that frequent flyers are really becoming the drink drivers of the modern era. It's something that we had considered was socially acceptable for a long time, almost aspirational. But frankly, some people taking vast numbers of short haul and long haul flights every year are contributing an excessive amount to the problem of climate change. Government is already thinking about issues around whether there should be a flying tax beyond 1 or 2 flights per year per family. And these things are starting to reach common currency of discussion. And again, there is a hugely important social norming piece of work to do here. If parish councils make a declaration and within that declaration they commit to never flying for council business, they can explain why that's important, and that kind of message starts to filter through. We've talked about existing buildings and how we must retrofit them and change the way they're heated, but the eighth change target is that we also need to do much more around our new buildings. Now, a great deal of this is out of the hands of local government and is driven by the National Building Standards regime. That doesn't mean that you can't engage with your local politicians around this, but again, it doesn't also mean that you can't raise awareness of really good building practice and use your placemaking powers that you have through neighbourhood planning to start demanding more. And in some cases that is possible. And again, working with your local authorities. The other important thing about this is we have local vernacular and we have buildings that we have always had that we like and that speak of our area. And we have to be realistic about the fact that new buildings may need to look different to function in a warmer climate. They may have to be differently constructed, differently oriented, and have a very different look to them. So what we need to do is proactively look for the new vernacular for our area rather than constantly trying to ape the past, which is no longer fit for purpose in a warmer future. The ninth target is to think about our consumption patterns generally as a society. We need to buy less and reuse and repair more. And this moves very much into that area of complex work, which I mentioned earlier. This is really hugely about conversations and about supporting the development of things like local repair cafes, thinking about shopping locally, thinking about creating narratives locally within local newsletters around how we manage the materials that we buy. These are very much things that parish councils probably feel that they don't have any say in and don't have any control over. But just constantly reiterating the message on this is one of the most important things you can do. And linked to that is our recycling rate. What we do use, we have to maximise recycling of. And it's sort of noted that if we don't get recycling up to about 65% of all waste collected, then we're not really approaching anything like a circular economy. The best local authority areas in the country at the moment are achieving about in the high 40% of recycling, and some are as low as 25-30%. There tends to be a fairly antagonistic relationship between parish and town councils and their waste collection authority, which is usually the district. And this is the time to really come together and think about how we can work much more constructively on encouraging people, on informing people, and on educating people about recycling to really support our waste collection authority. And again, just to be aware of the slight myth around energy from waste. If we are sending lots of plastic to be incinerated, then we are effectively burning fossil fuels because plastic is in its virgin form oil. So we really need to think about the reuse and reduce before we think about the recycle, and not see energy from waste as a sort of panacea for everything, because you don't have to think about it for very long to realize it's not a terribly sustainable model to produce things to burn them. The 11th target is we need to think about altering our dietary patterns and reducing the amount of food that we throw away. This can be a real sensitive issue in rural areas, and particularly where meat production is a big part of the local economy. But fundamentally, all of the models agree that Western societies need to reduce the amount of meat that they're eating, because that's a big, big contributor to our national carbon footprint. Helpfully, though, British raised beef and lamb has a very low carbon footprint compared to imported meat. And that's not just because of the transport involved in bringing beef from Brazil or from the USA. It's because our beef production systems are quite low intensity, and we have a lot of outdoor raised grass-fed beef and lamb, whereas other countries tend to do this more intensively. So perhaps a useful balance here is to be encouraging your communities through behavior change information to reduce the amount of meat they're eating, but where they do retain a meat eating portion in their diet, to switch that to locally produced, high quality, low carbon footprint beef. And that feels like something that could serve both the local rural economy as well as the climate change agenda. We also, in the 12th target, need to think more widely about how we manage the land around us. This is where we start to get really quite beyond the role of local government, and this becomes something related to the role of those that own and manage the land. But again, being aware of and engaging in those conversations and helping to convene groups of local landowners together to understand the impact that they're having on carbon emissions is a role that local government, both at the parish and town and district, can play. It's really important that we think about how we are fertilizing the land and how we are ploughing the land and how we are managing the land, because a huge amount of carbon is tied up in soil. And the more we disturb that soil, the more we release. There are practices well understood around permaculture, reduced ploughing regimes, and agroforestry, which combines trees with cropping. And they're not terribly well practiced in the UK. So again, this feels like an area of discussion and awareness raising that is not outside of the remit of local government. And the final target is that once we've reduced everything we can in terms of our emissions, so we've done everything we can to mitigate, we need to be thinking about actively pulling carbon out of the atmosphere through carbon storage strategies. And 2 areas of work for local councils will be crucial here. The first is the planting and management of more trees, along with, if it's in your area, protecting and restoring peatland if that's the environment around you. But the second one is using more timber in construction. And this goes back to what I referred to before about thinking about what our vernacular is. When we use timber in construction, we are storing carbon for the long term, for many hundreds of years. But the normal construction type in many parts of the UK uses relatively little timber. So again, if we are not thinking about what is needed in the future and always harping back to the designs of the past, we will find that we're really missing a trick there. The final thing to think about before we start into the action planning is that your action plan can't have any unicorns in it, by which we mean imaginary technologies that don't exist yet. It's very common for people to seize on ideas that sound like what we do at the moment, but don't have any pesky side effects. And we often hear about new miniature nuclear that's coming online, or new vehicles that will allow us to behave the way we normally do, but with no emissions. Anything that goes into an action plan at this stage has to be proven. It has to be something that's readily available right now. This is emergency. We don't have time to wait 2 years for something to be invented. It has to be investable. If it needs money to do, then it has to look like a good business proposition to people who are going to put their money on the table. And it has to be readily available. We can't be dealing with things that are only in pilot stage at this time in our plan. So we've looked there for all of the changes we need to make. There are 13 areas of our lives that we need to change fairly radically, and we need to therefore bring our levers of influence to bear. And this is, again, I referred to it in local transport, where local government needs to stop abdicating responsibility between the levels. We cannot be in a position where we're saying we won't do anything on transport because that's the county's job, and the county's saying we won't do anything on behaviour change because that feels like the parish's job. Everybody needs to get involved in everything. when we're in an emergency situation. So the levers of influence are the same really for every level of government, from the parish through to national government. Firstly, we have direct control, which is the buildings and estate and operations and so on that we own ourselves, and also our investments and our spending decisions. How we choose to spend our money and who we spend it with has a big impact on other industries. That leads into procurement and commissioning. We not only have money that we keep invested, but we buy things and we commission things, and we need to bring our influence to bear on those people to say we value and we will score more highly those who have a low carbon business model. We have a place shaping role. Districts are obviously the holders of this in the sense of the local plan, but parish and town councils have neighbourhood planning, and they also are an important part of developing the local plan. So rather than becoming involved in that in an antagonistic sense and in a challenging sense, come forward to your district about how you want them to use the local plan to deliver a low carbon future for you. Then we have these more soft levers of influence. We have showcasing. How do we demonstrate what other people are doing that's good? How do we promote and reward good practice? And how do we show people that this is now the new normal? And our convening power. How do we bring people together? How do we help partnerships get built? What support can we provide, in terms of venues or a little bit of funding to help other people get on and do things in our community? And finally, engaging. How do we take this huge global issue and make it relevant to our local community? And how do we communicate with our local residents about that? And going back to the very early slide, those top two are what we call complicated work, technical work. It's often about spreadsheets and budgets and gadgets and gizmos. All of this stuff at the bottom is complex work. It's about society, it's about engaging, and it's about give and take and consultation. And it's difficult, but it cannot be overlooked. So action planning basically puts these all together. We take our levers of influence, and for every target that we need to achieve, we have to see how we can apply every single one of our levers of influence to that. So as I said, it's not meant to be easy. It's not meant to be simple. If it was, we wouldn't be where we are. We have an action planning matrix which we've developed, which brings those levers of influence and those change targets together, through which we look at what action can we take, what time frame would we do that over, and also crucially, what co-benefits would it bring? Because some of what we need to do to tackle the climate emergency will deliver a great deal of what we want to see for a healthier, more active, more resilient and more equal society. So it's useful when action planning to actually think about those co-benefits. We can do this in a village hall setting when we are allowed to meet, but if not, we can do it online by jointly annotating these big documents together. And that's what the action planning exercise this afternoon will focus on.